Vantor, delivering sovereign spatial intelligence that gives nations the ground truth.
Hello and welcome back. At the time of recording this podcast, a ceasefire deal between the United States and Iran seems to have been worked out. It's too early to comment on the details, but hopefully it's going to hold. I've no idea for how long. I hope that in future the Australian government is not quite as hasty, egging on the United States the next time they decide to bomb another country. What else is happening? It's too early in the morning to see any of Donald Trump's birthday UFC cage fight. It's something that I don't plan to watch, but I'm fairly sure that at least one Australian cabinet minister will be staring adoringly at the screen in the hope of getting a glimpse of Pete Hegseth, the macho comic book character self-identified as the US Secretary of War. Now, I'm going to start with a couple of corrections, one of them a very important one, and that is in the last podcast when I was describing the Virginia Block 7 submarines, plural, the new one that originally Australia was going to get, but where now, if we get anything, they will be all second-hand ones. I said incorrectly that a Block 7 Virginia-class submarine was 140 metres in length. That's not true. They're 115 metres in length, but the main thing is that the information I conveyed about the number of Tomahawk missiles was correct. 40 Tomahawks on a Block 7 versus 12 on a Block 4. Now, I also was not sufficiently clear when I spoke about the characteristics of the German-Norwegian Type 12 CD submarine. When I spoke about 40 days of endurance, that's 40 days of underwater endurance. I put that later in the segment, but just for the sake of clarity, it can remain underwater for 40 days just on its fuel cells and has another few days on top of that using its battery pack. Now, I have some more AUKUS stupidity to talk about, but I'll try and get through that fairly quickly so that we can have a few words about Ukraine, a topic that is chronically underreported in Australia. Now, the quick summary is largely through the use of drones and robots, Ukraine is turning the tide against Russia, something that receives zero coverage in Australia and is also, it would seem, of zero interest for our government. Ukraine has negotiated security agreements with a large number of countries. I think that the number 28 comes to mind, but for some inexplicable reason, negotiations with Australia have been stalled for about a year, and I assume this is because of the complete indifference of our foreign and defence ministers, and I'll have a lot more to say about this in due course. Now, winding back the clock, I woke up last Friday morning, this was June 12th, to see a fair bit of media coverage about the visit of Defence Minister Richard Marles to the UK, and more particularly the unfortunately timed resignation of the British Defence Secretary, Mr Healey, which occurred just a couple of hours before the two of them were to hold a joint media conference. Whoops, that's a little bit embarrassing. So our Defence Minister was left high and dry as Mr Healey quit. Now, the government, of course, was very quick to say that Healey's resignation has no impact at all on AUKUS, nothing to do with AUKUS. Well, that's only true in the sense that it wasn't prompted particularly by AUKUS, but it does have an impact because Healey's resignation was over the issue of UK defence spending, or in his assessment, the UK is not spending nearly enough to fund all of its commitments, including AUKUS. Put simply, the UK, post-Brexit, basically can afford either a powerful nuclear deterrent or a moderately strong conventional force, but it cannot do both. This situation will get worse as the US continues withdrawing from NATO, meaning almost certainly the UK and other European countries will need to do a whole lot more. The noises coming out of the United States is that in the next few months they will start to draw down on their combat aircraft strength in Europe, and some further reductions in troop numbers are also possible. Now, getting back to the UK visit, I noticed that the cancelled press conference with ex-Minister Healey was scheduled, doesn't have any submarines there. It has a few surface ships, because if it had been held at Faslane in Scotland, that's where the submarines are, the background, rather embarrassingly, would have been 5 Astute-class SSNs. That's the entire operational fleet, tied up alongside wharves, awaiting maintenance and unable to put to sea. At the moment, the 6th Astute class is undergoing sea trials, and the 7th is still under construction. So the UK has no attack submarines able to be deployed. And I think even more embarrassingly, one of those submarines tied up alongside is HMS Anson, that made the propaganda visit to Australia in February. I've referenced that in previous podcasts. PR stunt, nothing more. Now, the visit of Anson gave Minister Marles the opportunity to blare like a foghorn that it was further proof that AUKUS was on track, when, of course, it demonstrated no such thing. My understanding is that Anson has experienced reactor piping issues. That's on the Rolls-Royce PRW2, the design of which has been criticised from a safety point of view. So the government made such a big deal about the Anson visit and the fact that some Australian companies supplied parts while it was at HMAS Sterling, but I bet you won't hear a peep out of them about Anson breaking down and being out of action for an indefinite period of time. And let's just hope it hasn't broken down because of those Australian spare parts. And by the way, the Royal Navy surface fleet isn't in much better shape. I read quite recently that the lead ship in the Type 45 destroyer series, HMS Daring, which I had the pleasure of sailing on back in 2013, went in for repairs in 2017 and will be going back to sea fairly soon. 2017 and now, people can do the maths, 8 years. In other words, the ship has been longer in a yard under repair than it has actually managed to operate. But getting back to the Astutes, many journalists, including me, have expressed an interest in seeing how Astutes are built, and we would like to visit the yard at Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria. It's operated by BAE Systems, the prime contractor. But these requests have always been resisted by UK Inc., the UK government, BAE themselves, citing security concerns. You can't let journalists onto a site like that. Well, I can assure people that's rubbish. Now, I've been to several submarine construction yards, including one building a nuclear-powered submarine, and I can assure people that there are no genuine security concerns whatsoever. You can't take photographs, and if you go into a control room, there are certain areas that are fenced off, screens covered up. But when it comes to the yard itself, it's just lots of big pieces of metal and lots of big blokes, because it's mainly men, with welders and angle grinders doing their thing. There are a couple of good reasons why journalists will never be invited, but that's got nothing to do with security. I'm informed by Cameron Stewart from The Australian, who I know very well, good journalist. He visited Barrow at his own expense, and I'll paraphrase only slightly. I won't use Cameron's exact words to me. He said it's total dump and no one in their right mind would ever move there for work. Now, that matters because BAE Systems say they will need about an extra 10,000 workers for the 2 programs, the Dreadnought SSBNs, the big ballistic missile firing submarines that they're building, and then followed by SSN AUKUS, this submarine that the British are designing for us. which will supposedly eventually be constructed at Osborne in Adelaide. Now, that's the first reason. They just don't want us to see what a dreadful mess Barrow is. They wouldn't want any reporting on that. But the second reason is there was a large fire in the main assembly hall in October 2024, and the full extent of the damage has never been revealed, though at the time company people described it as significant, a word that was quickly dropped. Now, apparently that fire burned for 14 hours, and I saw some news footage at the time, people can still find it on the internet, with this entire huge building glowing with flames. It looked like a vision from hell. But of course, the official narrative soon changed to it was just a minor fire, just a scratch, so to speak, and nothing serious had actually happened. I don't believe a word of it. Anyway, in summary, UK shipbuilding is a mess, and it's hard to imagine that any of the timetables for SSN AUKUS are going to be even remotely met. If I hear Richard Marles saying yet again that everything is happening at pace, one of his favourite descriptions, I'm going to throw up. Now, what else? I also saw a media report that Dennis Richardson, former Secretary of the Department of Defence, former ambassador to Washington, who I know, saying basically that 3 old Block 4 Virginia-class submarines, we're back onto the Virginias, are still a better level of capability than the Collins class we have. Well, that's certainly true, but that's a completely unfair comparison because Collins is now a 40-year-old design. For a proper discussion, you would have to compare a Virginia Block 4 with sort of contemporary conventional diesel-electric designs, and the difference in performance, as I keep on saying, is narrowing. But since Dennis mentioned Collins, the life of type extension. In the last episode, I indicated I would have a bit more to say about that and what happened in Senate estimates. Basically, Navy and Defence, I thought, were completely disingenuous, arguing that the LOTE hadn't been cancelled, that all that had happened was that the strategy for the LOTE had changed. In other words, the submarines won't be upgraded to extend their life. All that will happen is that Defence and ASC will do enough routine maintenance to keep them going. Anyway, I thought it was all very, very deceptive. Anyway, this Dennis Richardson approach, which is fairly typical of AUKUS Pillar 1 boosters, is basically, we don't care what it is as long as it's powered by a nuclear reactor. But more than that, it has to be a nuclear reactor built by English-speaking people, because otherwise we would be speaking with the French and especially with the South Koreans. It's getting a bit dated, but Senate estimates about a fortnight ago, you can milk those sessions for information for months to come. It explains why it's still all the way with AUKUS, with CDF David Johnson explaining under questioning that about 900 Australians, service personnel and a few civilians, are embedded in the US and the UK systems, with the vast majority of those being in the United States. 900. So that explains why people can't think beyond the US and the UK when so many of our defence people are embedded in their systems. And another thing worth mentioning as a result of estimates, defence expenditure drops next year by about $700 million, taking it down to a mere 2.02% of GDP. So that's not a particularly encouraging record. Now, another former Defence Secretary, a very recent one, Greg Moriarty, who's our new ambassador to Washington, appeared on TV just a couple of days ago to make some comments from Washington about AUKUS, and he was asked whether he had any concerns about the ability of the US industrial base to produce enough Virginia-class submarines to be in a position to supply some to Australia. And rather than doing the Richard Marles thing of saying, oh, nothing to worry about here, it's all happening at pace. He was a bit more circumspect, saying that, well, yes, big investments are being made, but the program is not yet where it needs to be. Now, that is fair and accurate and reasonable, and I just wish that our politicians were able to say the same sort of thing. But they don't want to, because once you start going down that path, if any journalists had the ability to follow up, the question to the minister would be, well, what is the percentage chance, in your view, of production being lifted to 2 Virginias per year or 2.33 per year? Now, if a minister said, well, 99.9%, people could relax, fine. But if a minister told the truth and said, well, it's more like 50%, the complacent Australian public might finally start waking up. As in, is it really wise to be spending this huge amount of money when the probability of success is only 50%? The tactics of defence in this have always been clear. Throw such a huge amount of money at AUKUS Pillar 1 to make it impossible for a government, any government, to back out. The total wasted on the failed attack class program was about $4 billion, and with AUKUS we are already over $9 billion, and that amount will accelerate, and we are a decade away from having any useful capability. And another shocking part of this formula is that the government and defence planners actually, I think indifferent is the word that I would use when I discuss with them the possibility of Australia receiving no Virginia-class submarines. They basically say, oh, well, we'll just muddle through with the Collins fleet, and the main game for us is the construction of SSN AUKUS in Adelaide. We'll just write off those tens of billions of dollars. I'm not aware of that sort of nonchalant attitude being apparent in any other sector of public policy, and I'll be elaborating on that a lot in future episodes. Now, as promised, I'm going to conclude with a few words about what's happening in Ukraine. And Ukraine has been making territorial gains. I think that I've mentioned that in the past, but those gains are continuing. There are a number of Russian units that are coming close to being encircled, and Ukraine has now extended the drone kill zone from previously, it was about 20 kilometres wide, to now 40, even 50 kilometres wide, and the Ukrainians are disrupting Russian logistics to the point where the Russians are having great difficulty resupplying troops on the front. They are having big problems. Their economy is also having big problems as the Ukrainians strike, in particular, at their energy infrastructure. The Australian government needs to get off its backside. It needs to sign the security treaty with Ukraine, and it also needs to do more on the funding side to really deliver the sort of final blow to Russia and get them to negotiate. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
Vantor delivers sovereign spatial intelligence so nations can own the ground truth. See how at vantor.com.